That's cool. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Rob. This is going out to all the people who play my work and people who are looking forward to Riley and Rochelle. And we're going to chat to the guy who,
Yeah.
in a very literal sense, not indirectly, not obscurely, not in the air, but actually completely inspired the genesis of the game in a very weird and interesting way. Rob Harvilla,
Oh man.
who
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, just for the very very few people who don't know who you are, can you just explain a little bit about yourself and also about your podcast 60 songs that
Sure.
explain the 90s?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. This is quite an honor. I don't believe I've ever, had any role in inspiring a video game before, and as a lifetime, at least casual gamer, like I'm thrilled about this. Like this is a career highlight to have inspired or helped inspire a video game. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hmm.
Well, let's see here. I've been a rock critic for about 20 years. I started in 2000. Came up mostly through alt weeklies, which kind of exist technically, but kind of don't exist anymore. From Ohio originally. Worked in Columbus, Ohio. Worked in Oakland, California for a while. I was in New York City. I was at the Village Voice for 5 years. I'm back in Ohio now. I've written for Spin. I've written for Deadspin. And I've been at the Ringer since it launched, I guess in 2016, the longest job I've ever had. And it was all written, all just rock critic stuff for most of the time. And then it was 2020, right? It was the fall of 2020. I started a podcast called 60 Songs That Explain the 90s,
Hmm.
which is fairly self-explanatory, I guess. It's just one song and one special guest per episode. And I sort of write a script, talking about that song, both, the rock critic type, analysis of it or whatever, plus,
Hmm.
like personal memories, like I'm trying to figure out how to work in memoir without it being indulgent, I guess. And just it's sort of a mix of I guess we were thinking like pop-up video, Song Exploder, of course, that rad
Hmm.
podcast. Um, and there was one other major source that I can't remember now. Like the Ringer has like the rewatchables, right, where they
Hmm.
talk about one
Hmm.
movie, just stuff like that. Just a mixture of nostalgia with like critical analysis, reanalysis in some cases. Yeah, it's been great. I've never had a bigger response to anything that I've done, and that's sort of I
Yeah.
guess the parasocial nature of podcasts, right? Like it's my actual voice in
Hmm.
people's ears. It's a very strange notion to me, but it's been really awesome, and it leads to awesome stuff like this.
Well, it comes off as like very personal, right? And it's like one of the
Yeah,
things I guess which is kind of singular about the rewatchables is there's almost no. It's like 10 seconds and they're straight onto the film. There's no preamble. Whilst with yours,
right.
it's almost entirely
It's all
preamble.
preamble.
you know, there's been long
Yeah,
starts, and there's these kind of beautifully long kind of extended tangents, that take you all sorts of
yeah.
places through
Well,
your
thank you.
teenage years up to the songs, and it's
Yeah.
really cool. And I'd listened to a lot of them, like a lot. And the first thing which really like struck me about them was I had no idea how you were pumping these out. Like how, and this is something that I still kind of have to ask, which is there's so much work goes into every single one, and there's so many of them. How are you doing it?
It's first of all, the first thing that happened, like the biggest difference between the first episode, which was Alanis Morissette, and
Hmm.
the episodes I'm doing now, it's like they are now fully like 10 times longer.
Hmm.
Like across the arc of the show, which now spans like 75 episodes, like the scripts have gotten longer and longer and longer to where now, like I wrote one yesterday that was 9,999 words. I
Oh
was
yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh
yeah.
God, like what I've also, if you're looking at raw numbers, I'm writing more than I ever have, which is
Hmm.
very strange, but I guess it's just enough of a different type of writing. If I'm sitting down and I got to write an 800-word
Yeah.
review of like an Adele record, right? That mode, that critical mode, like that structure, like that's ingrained in me at this point, I would
Hmm.
hope. But something about writing a script where the tangents are the points, like the tangents are now sort of built in,
Yeah.
and they can veer off into personal reminiscences. They can talk about other songs. There's something about that kind of writing even though I like fully write it out, like I cannot improvise
Yeah.
them like one word, like down to where I might laugh, or like change my voice or anything like that. Like I have to know exactly what I'm gonna do before I do it. But I guess that style of writing is just different enough and just a little freer.
Mhm.
So where like volume wise, it's easier to like generate more words just because it's a more casual
Yeah.
kind of writing. That's the closest I can get, I
Well, you're
guess.
writing it for your own voice. I mean, the funny thing is, like, when
Yeah.
we first did this, I actually wanted to have a kind of podcast idea that
Yeah.
occupied the thing and was a kind of almost like a Greek chorus to the game. And I wrote to you and said, "Can you do the voice?"
Mhm.
And because of work complications, it wasn't possible. So I got
Yeah,
I got
yeah.
someone to imitate
Sorry.
you, and I will one day wrote it in your voice, which you saw. But and then I
Yeah,
got a woman
yes.
called Sarah, who's a very good imitator, to do something
Yeah.
in the spirit. And I think I wrote in the performance notes, I wrote "all dog, no cat," and that was my,
All dog, no
all dog,
cat.
no cat.
Alright.
You know, it was
What does
like
that
a
mean?
well, I
I'm
guess it's
into
like a
it.
sort
What
of
is yeah.
golden, like a puppyish energy to the whole thing, is what I kind of thought.
Alright.
But, I
Hey.
mean, that was the way I felt like, explicating
Hey.
it. I mean, I will send that to you at some point. It
Wow.
won't ever see the light of day, but,
Please. Oh, that's too
she
bad, but
plays
all dog, no cat is a new one on me, yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, I guess, so this story kinda comes to a head, right, which is I've been listening to lots of these things, and this is,
Yeah.
uh, in November last year, right? And so I'm
Mhm.
leaving my house, I go to the cafe, got a flat white, and I'm listening to the Celine Dion one, and
Good order.
that one takes a little while to get somewhere as well. And then there's a moment where and it's but I realize now the reason for it is
Doesn't it
because
though?
well, you spend a lot of time setting up the paradigm for analysis because I think the problem with Celine Dion is that people have a very strong opinion to the extent that they've never
Mhm.
really built up a framework for actually considering her work, and I think that that's
Yeah.
something that is kind of necessary for her a little bit more than, like, let's say, Elliott Smith, for example, where people have this kind of
Sure.
big, body of kind of consideration and, and the language
Mhm.
of consideration, how to talk about power ballads, which I think hopefully we'll do a little bit later, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
it comes to this point and you say something along the lines of, "I don't suppose we're going to get any further without considering this guy." And we play a bit of Miss Misery. And you say, "Yes, at the
Uh-huh.
70th annual Academy Awards, Miss Misery from Good Will Hunting and My Heart Will Go On were nominated." And time stops still. Like it just stopped still because
Yeah.
it was something that I kind of knew, but I hadn't
Yeah.
really considered the juxtaposition of the two. And immediately
Mhm.
I knew that there was, a story in there. And the reason
Yeah.
why it seemed to me was obvious because I thought what's interesting is that in this moment you couldn't have had two people who were more different, but in some ways you
Mhm.
couldn't have had two people who were more the same because they were
Right.
both prisoners of authenticity. You know,
Prisoners of authenticity,
Elliot
yeah.
Smith maybe a little less than Kurt Cobain, but very much,
Hmm.
in that moment he was, flying the flag for the counterculture, and he was
Right.
kind of stuck. I don't know if he felt that way, but he couldn't have made a disco record at that point. And Celine
No.
Dion was terribly uncool, and and in some ways, she could never have become Elliott Smith, and Elliott Smith could never have become Celine Dion, even if
Mhm.
they'd wanted to. And I suddenly thought, well, there's something really interesting there because you've got these two
Yeah.
characters who are both bound by the same social currency, living on, and there's a Romeo and Juliet dynamic there. But hang on a sec.
Absolutely.
What else is
2
the
houses.
90s? Yeah, two has of
Yeah.
equal dignity. Well, what would happen if this
Well,
collided with the other 90s
right.
genre, which is rom-com? Which is
Yeah.
what if they fell in love? If it's like,
Yeah.
Notting Hill or Pretty Woman,
Mhm.
I thought
Sure.
immediately this is one of those archetypes, but it's all
Right.
framed within the idea of the culture and the counterculture. That I mean, that was what
Mhm.
was important to me, but, like, you were the one who brought it up. What to you was kind of culture what was going on with the kind of cylinders that drive our culture that was so
Hmm.
significant about Celine Dion and Elliott Smith being nominated at the Oscars?
I spent, like, 3 days trying to think of a way to talk about this without saying this word, but, like, I don't think I can do it. Are you familiar with rockism? The concept of rockism?
For our listeners, please. Enlighten us.
But okay, I do not want to get very far into the weeds of this, but among rock critics, there's sort of this concept called rockism, and it's the idea that it used to be that rock critics gave far more weight to like basically white guys with guitars.
Mhm,
The white guy with the guitar singing, a sad song about his feelings is more authentic and has more cultural
mhm,
value than the pop diva, right? Which is fake and plastic and like choreography and flash, and like she might not have even written that song, like et cetera, et cetera. There's
mhm,
something fake about her and something real about him. That is a very, very generalized description of this thing. There was a New York Times article that was very famous from like the mid 2000s that sort of brought it into the mainstream. And it's this idea of reconsidering pop music now. It's like there's as much authenticity, there's as much art to like what feels like disposable pop music as there is to like sensitive singer songwriter type stuff. Like the fact, like Beyonce by default is probably the most critically beloved, artist
mhm,
out right now. But I don't know if that would have been true like 20 years ago, given
mhm,
this framework, given this idea that like the Neil Young paradigm or whoever, like all of that music is wonderful, of course, but it was held above pop music for the longest time for a lot of critics. And there's this sort of this arc back and forth where like critics, like you mentioned before we started talking, like Pitchfork is re-reviewing records, right? And
mhm,
in some cases, explicitly going back to reviews that they'd written before, and changing, the scores and changing the entire attitudes. And there's a lot of reasons that they do that. But there is this general idea that, like, as you say, at the time, Celine Dion was like terrifically uncool,
mhm.
and was not getting like the pop critic respect that certainly Elliott Smith was getting. And it's just a little different now. Okay, that I was trying to do that in under 30 seconds and I didn't quite get there. But okay, so the moments, there's something so pure about the moment when Elliott Smith and Celine Dion are sharing the stage at the
Mhm,
Oscars. As I just said, you cannot imagine two more different people or two different approaches, like just two raw paradigms. Like Elliott Smith goes out there in like a rumpled white suit, just with his
mhm,
guitar, looking just abjectly uncomfortable, which of course he would be. And he sings, Miss Misery, which is this beautiful, very quiet, very sensitive, very intimate song, from this very popular, but like an indie movie, right?
mhm.
Like this is the 90s indie movie, which and Celine Dion comes out and like, wasn't there a boat? Like they constructed the Titanic itself and the orchestra was like in this like two-story Titanic replica, and she
Yeah.
sings My Heart Will Go On and just this huge bombast. And also it's clear to everyone that she's going to win.
Mhm.
Right? Like, didn't Madonna present the award and like get in trouble for being like, what a surprise, it's My Heart Will, like
Yeah.
it was a foregone conclusion that Celine Dion was gonna win. And just that moment, that contrast between Elliott Smith and Celine Dion and just the entire aura, the entire machine around those two people, like separately, like just that's like the purest description of that divide that I can imagine. Like
Mhm.
those two people nominated for the same awards, sharing the same stage, like both singing their songs within minutes of each other, but just two different universes from a cultural, from a critical standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something which is like really interesting. I think about the conception of a lot of music, but particularly for some
Mm.
reason it seems in the 90s and the late 90s, which is that the audience socially and culturally are not very different from each other in a kind of pure demographic sense. There's your
No.
mum versus you. It's that sort of thing, or your sister versus
Yes.
you.
Uh-huh.
A lot of white
Yeah.
kids in the suburbs, some like Celine Dion, some like Nirvana, right? But
Mhm,
from a
mhm,
kind of cultural stance, there's this enormous weight put on
mhm.
this, and kind of this term which we see, which we arrive at. I suppose it comes from like the 70s originally, but you see it a lot in the 90s is selling out, right? And this is my
Mhm.
question, which is, with our kind of modern social, systems, kind of analysis sort of head on, what was selling out really all about? 'Cause,
There's
it wasn't always about
yeah.
money, right? We're talking about gender, we're talking about race,
No,
we're talking
it
about a
was
lot of things, right?
mhm. There are so many concepts from the '90s that reoccur, like, on my show that I feel like I have to try and explain to the young people
Yeah.
of today, and I can't. It's like you had to go to a store and you had to buy a CD, and it cost, like, $20. You could only listen to that CD, you couldn't listen to
One or
any
the
other,
other,
like
yeah.
yes, and selling out is one of those. It is getting harder to remember, to fully grasp how big a deal that was at the time, and it's selling out define selling out as the '90s understood it. Like,
Mhm,
it was about authenticity, and it was this idea that you're doing what you're doing, but you're not doing it for the money. You're not doing it for the fame, for the adulation. It's pure. What you're doing is pure, and you're doing it for the right reasons, and it's getting to the right people, and you're not pandering to the unwashed masses.
mhm,
It's like Kurt Cobain obviously is bound up in a lot of this. Like whatever he felt about it, he goes from like Sub Pop Records, which is this beloved, or indie rock label of the '90s, and
mhm.
then suddenly he's a mainstream, magazine cover rock star. The way like Poison or Motley Crue or whoever were
Yeah.
rock stars. Like this is the turn that happens late '80s to early '90s, and just I he seemed to publicly grapple with like and Eddie Vedder too. Like every
Mhm.
major '90s rock star at least had to pretend to grapple with this idea of being uncomfortable with their fame
Yeah.
and feeling like what the pure thing to do is to play like in a basement for 25 people who really get it, and to put it out on this very cool, very underground record label. What's not cool is like playing arenas. What's not cool is being at the Oscars,
Mhm.
and that's only a very small part of, I guess, the overall selling out thing. Chuck Klosterman's book, the '90s book that he
Mhm.
put out like last year, like it's at least one chapter. It feels like the whole book is sort of animated by the idea that like what is selling out.
Mhm.
The last thing I'll say is the movie Reality Bites, right, which I
Which
have
we
not
obviously
revisited.
borrow the title from.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's been a while since I watched it, but the whole divide is that Winona Ryder has to choose between Ethan Hawke, who is like the Elliott Smith, like
Yeah.
wry,
Well,
dismissive underground
he's
musician.
more of
Yeah.
a dick, though. I mean, this is the whole Ebert
Oh,
discussion,
sure.
isn't this? Is what Roger Ebert, he said she picks the wrong guy. She should go with
Right. That's
Stiller
the
because
whole thing.
he treats her well,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
she's just a
Hmm.
crap videographer with a crap boyfriend, right? Yeah,
That's a very good way of describing
I've
that. Yes.
interrupted your paradigm, though, for those
Oh
who
no,
haven't
that's
seen
good though.
Reality Bites. Yeah. So is
But
the
yeah,
Ethan
the
the
whole
base
point is I'm sorry. She just has to choose between Ethan Hawke, the cool guy, and Ben Stiller, the uncool guy who is
Mhm,
like stable and has a job and has a career, and is uptight. And the choice to pick Ben Stiller would have coded to like the people watching the
mhm,
films in the '90s as selling out,
yeah.
right? And she ends up with the right guy, but like as Roger Ebert says, and I think I agree with him, like that was not actually the right choice.
Yeah, I mean, like, one of my favorite jokes in Riley and Rochelle, it's not the funniest, it's actually done by Sarah, who did the impression. It's she's playing Riley's manager when he's just starting out and sort of selling tapes out of the back of his van, and she
Yeah.
says, "Oh, I know you're worried about selling out, but come on, I don't think it matters anymore. It's 1993 for God's sake. I mean, look, Kurt Cobain listened to ABBA, and look what happened to him. He sold millions of records. That's my favorite little bit of dark comedy in the game.
Yeah.
And there's that
Ugh.
common conversation, and one of the other things that we decided quite early on that Rochelle would be mixed race, and that was because we wanted to
Mhm.
bring Whitney Houston's story into it a little bit as well, and some of the color
Absolutely.
dynamics that, with Whitney
Mhm.
being whiteified on some of her early records, and then obviously Rochelle kind of is bisexual, and that is another thing that we kind of look
Yeah.
into, and how this kind of affects things. But the basic idea is that Rochelle will always struggle with being more seen as more than just a performer or a beauty,
Right.
and that even when she's writing, it's never considered that it's really her work,
Mhm. Mhm.
or that she can really do it. And whilst
Right.
Riley kind of gets handed that stuff sort of as his birthright, and then later becomes quite surprised when he, accidentally sells out and people turn on him, and that's and it goes through these various,
Yeah,
paroxysms of various, ups and downs and stuff like that. I mean,
yeah,
I think for me, like, it was, I thought that, um, you know, their careers, um it was, very easy to consider how their careers would happen, but it was not that Riley necessarily had it always so easy, and I don't think that, for
mm,
instance, Elliott Smith always had it quite so
no,
easy either. It was not always sort of given to him, and he did find things, quite difficult, and he didn't always put out, amazing work. But then when we
mm,
kind of got to the actual romance side of things, I was very inspired by that, the other Ringer podcast, which is about the tabloids. Which, have you been
yeah,
listening to that at all?
oh yeah,
And
absolutely,
and
yeah,
and particularly about the, the Bennifer period and stuff
That's the
like
first
that.
episode, right? Yeah, yeah.
And I guess what I kind of want to ask is, what do you think would have happened if Celine Dion and Elliott Smith did fall in love? What would have happened to society in 1998?
It's hard, first of all, like, the other thing that I always have to convey to people is the internet, like, technically existed, but, like,
Yeah.
not in anything like we conceive of it now. Like, because the first, my brain is unfortunately wired now to be like Twitter would blow up, right? Like, but that's not how, the first of all,
I mean, it's such a bizarre
Celine,
question, but is it?
it's a bizarre question, but it's, Celine Dion, of course, at that point is with her manager,
Yeah,
so there is, first of all, that element, but it's, it would be a very salacious story,
yeah.
and there would be this question, and you kind of said, of like, people would turn on Elliot because, he was, well, first of all, I don't remember if I got into it, but my podcast or not,
Mhm.
when I did this episode, but like, there's Elliot Smith said at one point afterward, he sort of got the idea that people watched the Oscars and really felt bad for him. And it's like, I'm sorry that you had to be there and you had to follow,
Yeah,
you had to be with this terrible, garish spectacle. And Elliot Smith was like, no, Celine Dion was actually really nice to
yeah,
me. Like, she gave me a hug backstage. She could tell I was really nervous. Like, that hug really resonates for me, right? Like, that's why
yeah,
it's so rad that you build basically an entire game out of like taking that hug to
yeah.
its logical conclusion. Like, that's awesome. But like, there is, I love that moment because it shows like these are just two people, right? Like, they're two performers and they have their own, styles, certainly, and they have their own paradigms and their own histories, but they're both struggling
Mhm.
with their own shit, and they're both struggling, with fame,
Yeah.
and what underground fame requires you and what like the most mainstream possible fame
Mhm.
requires of you. And so they are more alike than different in terms of the raw experience that they're experiencing. They're on being on stage regardless of the circumstances. Like, that's an experience that, like, if you don't have it, if you
Mhm.
haven't had it, like, you can't know what it's like. Like, they know what it's like, even if everything else about them is so different.
Yeah.
And so, but this does not answer your question, which is, how
No.
would people react? It would be a huge, it's hard for me to sort of reconstitute like what tabloid media was like in 1988, and like how that 1998 and how that would immediately spread and where the conversation would primarily happen. But I think I would hope that people would like root for it and sort of take it as this very sweet and very surreal feeling
Mhm.
experience. But like, that it feels naive to say that when I think like the uglier part of it, would come to the forefront of like the media, the gossip media, certainly,
Mhm.
immediately.
I mean, do you think there's shades of Kim and Kanye here? Is that a kind of modern archetype, or is it totally different because they're almost transhuman, they're so high up above the rest of us now?
Kim and Kanye, it's there are parallels, but like, I think by the time they got together, they were both like uber famous people,
Mhm.
right? And I think it was like, oh, that makes sense. Like, who else are they gonna date? Who else are they gonna marry but each other? Like, you can't imagine either of them with civilians, or even regular famous people at that
Yeah.
point. Like I sort of took it at the time as like that was the only people left for them to marry was each other. Like that's
Yeah.
totally logical. I think that Elliot and Celine, in theory, is a weirder, more random pairing because
Mhm.
again, like it's hard to convey the 90s mindset where like those were two different musical universes and
Yeah.
like people who loved Elliott Smith were not supposed to also love Celine Dion or vice
Mhm.
versa. There was just that they were just parallel lines, and it's
Yeah.
partly changing critical attitudes, but it's also partly just streaming, right? Like where
Mhm.
now everybody listens to everything.
Yeah.
Those boundaries between genres don't exist anymore. And so it really is hard to convey in 2022 like how weird it was that they were even in the same room together.
I mean, it is, it's kind of, that's it's got that high school quality to it as well, doesn't it?
Right,
The way we're
right, yeah.
discussing it has this very kind of 90s high school thing. But I mean, one thing that, I mean, I wrote an article for a magazine about the stuff I'd learned, because obviously writing all the music, and we'll talk about that in a sec, but like writing all the
Yeah,
music, I'd listened
yeah.
to a lot of Celine Dion, and a lot of other,
Uh-huh.
and obviously a lot of, Elliott Smith as well. And I've listened to that my whole life, right? So, I mean, the
Yeah.
thing which really struck me is that now I feel that we are finally living in the world that Prince and Madonna created, which is that we are living.
Okay.
There is no, I'd say there is no major pop star apart from Adele, for various reasons, who is not in some way postmodern. Right? There is
Hmm,
every pop star now is somehow reflecting on a kind of meta discussion about sex or money or status or race or what it means to be a star, right? It's always part of the
hmm,
conversation. Like, for instance,
yeah.
Thank You Next by Ariana Grande, talking about her famous
Sure.
boyfriends, right? That
Right,
is,
right, right.
that is, or anything by Megan Thee Stallion or anything by
Mhm.
Lizzo, who's, of course, a Prince protege, and that
Yeah,
was the
yeah.
world that Prince and
Hmm,
Madonna started with these reflections on what it means to be a star whilst being a star, right? And the only holdout is Adele, and to some extent Ed Sheeran, but let's leave the boys out of this. I would say Ed's not a good example of,
okay.
any of the stuff, but Adele is
Yeah.
definitely a holdout to the kind of classic stars of the 70s and 80s. She's in some ways the
Hmm.
heir to Celine, you know.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about Elliot and Celine is neither of them are postmodern, right? They're actually
Hmm,
part of something that was just about to disappear over the horizon musically in the early 2000s,
hmm.
with things like the Strokes, which were these, the rise of the retro revolution, I would say,
Sure,
was
sure.
the
The
thing
return of
that
rock,
which
yes.
throwed us, meant that everything we were doing was always about a kind of collector's mentality, right? And we've kind
Mhm,
of only kind of
mhm,
gone from there. So like Celine and Elliot were the last of a type, I think, as well, which
hmm,
was he was the guy who descended from John Lennon's "I'm an artist" sort of thing,
mhm,
very literally, because obviously it was such a Lennon thing, and she was the person who came from Carole King's Tapestry,
mm.
and
Sure,
those were
sure.
non-postmodern great works of the 70s, which kind of carried on through the 80s, and aside from her Jim
Okay.
Steinman work, that's kind of where I see this is like a high mark of earnestness on both sides. Do you know what I mean? That he's doing this very earnest, authentic song, and she's doing this extremely earnest, fake song. But they're both quite straightforward in terms of their messaging
Yeah.
and their coding. I mean, what do you think of that as a sort of
No, the
idea?
idea of earnestness as a connector, yeah, I completely agree with that. Elliott Smith, I think of Jeff Buckley
Hmm.
a lot, right? As this very romantic figure, who writes these very intimate, very smoldering, intense. I think Jeff Buckley was far more of a showman and at least
Yeah.
felt like he was more comfortable, like
He was
discomfort.
gorgeous as well, which didn't hurt.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, the sort of heartthrob aspect that Elliott Smith had a little of, but what set Elliott apart was just I don't want to say a nervousness, but just an unease,
Mhm.
right? Like even in his intimate, music before any of the Oscar things happened, like what you hear in his music, or what I hear in his music, is like there's a tentativeness,
Yeah.
it's just so quiet, like he's trying not to wake somebody in the next room, whereas like Celine's trying to wake people like 3 blocks
Yeah,
over.
yeah, yeah.
But earnestness is a dividing line. I mean, Celine Dion's career is so wild, right?
Mhm.
And it's you sort of get at this in the game with sort of Rochelle's arc. Like she starts out like Miss Quebec, I think it is.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
like she. it's important. I think it's great that you sort of got that. Like Celine comes from like a pageant
Mhm.
mindset, and she comes from like a very young, like basically like a
Yeah,
childhood. Like she was very poor, of course,
yeah.
and it's just striving in that way. You know, it's a rags to riches story in like a very explicit kind of way, but it's bound
Mhm.
always by earnestness. Like it may be cheesy in like her, you know, her stage manner and like her facial expressions and like her gestures are so mannered, and like,
Mhm.
you know, there's entire movies about this at this point, but like she means it. Like all of that is bound up by the fact that she's so intent on what she's singing. She means it. There is an earnestness, you know, there
Yeah.
is not an irony that, as you say, or like a meta quality that you get with a lot of pop music now. And that's right in line with what Elliott Smith was doing. Absolutely. That's really interesting.
I mean, the arc of Rochelle, we'll use this as a segue into you can ask some stuff that you're curious about, is that she starts
Yeah.
as like a kind of pageant queen, and there's some extra content
Hmm.
later which explains a bit more of that. And she's got a white mom and a
Yeah.
black dad, presumably, who's out of the picture. And so you kind of
Mm.
get a sense of, and I think her girlfriend at the time, a secret girlfriend at the time, talks about how difficult it must have been for Rochelle and her brothers, growing up in kind of
Mhm.
semi, suburban Canada, entering these pageants and just winning all of them,
Mhm.
and becoming this star. And then she meets up with Osman, who's this, I would say quite an unfair characterization of Renee. And I'm the one who wrote it.
Yeah.
So, like,
Okay then.
but I mean, like, I think we had a bit of fun with it. I mean, the funny thing about Osman is he's actually based on a sort of family friend who I knew, who was the Turkish entrant to the Eurovision Song Contest in the year it got
Okay.
cancelled. So he was kind of as like a
Yeah.
homage to him, as
Huh.
well as an obvious reference to Celine's husband. And the music they make then is very inspired by, well, I think there's the cover, which is a straight rip from God, what album is it? But it's got Lolita on it, which is the one that for Corbusier,
Mm.
I took a lot of inspiration from the song Lolita, which she has, and I cannot remember the name of the album, but it's got that picture of her with the oddly shaped hand actually on the front. She's posing it's in a very strange way, and she's like that.
Uh-huh.
It's very strange, but yeah. And then she goes on and meets up with this Diane Warren-esque character, who even says
Uh-huh.
at one point, "What are all these songwriters doing? Shouldn't there just be one songwriter on every track?" I feel like we got ahead of the news on that one because she
Yeah.
got attacked by all the Beyonce fans for that. So we kind of got
Uh,
ahead of that. And
yes.
then she gets sent to Sweden to collaborate with Frida Samsberg, who's obviously,
Uh-huh.
Frida Sandberg, Max Martin half. And
Sure.
then, that's where the Oscars hit comes from. And then she kind of goes on and meets Riley and stuff, so she has
Yeah.
this kind of she does everything. But yeah, I mean, you wanted to
Yeah.
ask some stuff about that.
Well, I many years ago, I wrote like a very arduous boondoggle like novel that nobody wanted to read, where like it was
Hmm.
about a fake band, and like I didn't write the music, but I wrote like a lot of lyrics for a fake band.
Yeah.
And so I'm first of all, like I was just sort of fascinated by like the world building here of like, you know, I think it's pretty clear to somebody coming into this game cold, like they can figure out like maybe, you know, what inspiration you're taking, and that like, you know, oh, this is
Hmm.
like Celine Dion or like Elliott Smith, but like still you're building out like their discographies, right? And like there's
Hmm.
just I just spent a lot of time in that record room with the record player, just like,
Yeah.
and of course I was drawn to when Riley and Rochelle were playing together. Like this is the actual hypothetical what music would Celine Dion and
Yeah.
Elliott Smith have made together. But yeah, I was just I'm just fascinated by like creating fake songs that in your universe are pop hits, you know, like the
Yeah.
dude from the Fountains of Wayne, you know, like that thing you do,
Hmm.
something like that. Like I imagine it's very hard to write a fictional song that has to stand in a fictional universe as like a huge hit. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, some of you will know this, but I mean, I'm doing it for a little while now. So the first game that I made of this
yeah,
kind was Family, which was about a fake 80s kind of scene with various bands who were a little bit like the Smiths and a bit like Tears for Fears, and that was based upon rock family trees and used that kind of getting.
cool.
And then I made Rivals, which was about a rivalry between two country music stars who went their different ways, which was very inspired by Jay Farrar and Jeff Tweedy, and so that, and then I made
Yeah,
Echo
huh,
Beach, which was more contemporary. So this is kind of the
yeah,
third big kind of recreation kind of activity. And but for this one, it was harder, like because there was more. The songs were all the way through. Now they weren't just excerpts, and then it was about
Right,
taking in
right.
all these trends of the 90s and stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
like it was really fun. I had a free hand for when they met, right? Because I decided that okay,
Mhm.
Rochelle is going to be Riley's going to get her into something cooler, and she's going to want to go cooler, and
Yes.
he's gonna probably be listening to Radiohead at that point, and he's gonna and this is the nice thing about hindsight is you get to go a little ahead of the
Uh-huh.
curve because I get to do the thing which is like, what if Radiohead made an album between OK Computer and like Kid A, what would it sound like? Like
Sure.
if they kept the
Oh, boy.
instruments like in sort of 98,
Right,
99,
right.
what would that
Okay.
sound like? And so I wrote River of Roses, and that has,
Yeah, yeah.
things like the Ons Martineau in it. So I actually kind of cheat
Mhm,
and go
mhm.
5 years
There we
into
go.
the
Yeah.
future. And to be honest, it sounds more like I would say it's more inspired by Reckoner than anything else, actually.
I
Like it's
love that song.
yeah, I
I
mean that's
really
like
love that
probably my
song.
favorite Radiohead song, and so
That's a good favorite
yeah,
Radiohead
like
song. Yeah.
I think that one where it just kind of builds and builds and builds and builds. But
Mhm.
like, I think also the other thing with River of Roses is when I was writing, I was just aware that this is one of the best things I've written, and so it's going to go in a certain
It's
place.
awesome. Yeah, it's believable as that. Again, it's believable as, like, this is what these 2 people might have made, at this specific point in time, given, like,
Yeah,
what the music world was like, that all of that is so hard, but, like, that's I went right to that song,
yeah.
when I got to the discographies and, like, it's again, that must be very hard to do.
uh, for some. But yeah, and then Ghost is like it's obviously like Portishead and 007. So I kind of
Mhm,
figured
the
she was
trip hop
getting
thing,
into the
yeah,
trip
yeah.
hop thing, and maybe he was like, "Hey, there's a great record." But like, obviously, like I was writing for the voices, like Columbus. She's from Madagascar, so she's French, English, and
Mhm.
she's a very good Celine Dion impersonator. And she very very musical, so she could do everything. And then Riley is
Yeah,
Riley Catherall as his real, he's a real Riley, and he's from Australia, and he also worked with me on
yeah,
Rivals. So and he's got a really lovely
yeah.
voice, so that kind of helped. But yeah, I mean, like in terms of like recreating stuff, you're always stepping in and out of whether you want to be on the nose or not on the nose. So like some
Mhm.
stuff like Strong is very like falling into you. Like that's definitely like I want it to be a Diane Warren song, which means I want to have these very particular modulations so that are Diane does, right? So like
Right.
she does these well they're called like modular switches, right? But it basically means that like
Mm.
she doesn't do these kind of they're very subtle, you don't always notice them. Probably the most distinctively kind of non-distinctive ones are in like what's the Leanne Rimes song? How do I?
How do I
Yeah, how
live?
do I
I was just
live?
thinking
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so, like, very distinctive that it switches key between verse and chorus without having
Uh-huh,
a kind of
uh-huh.
truck what they call a truck driver's key change, and
Right, right.
that goes back to Carole King, who has obviously did that on, like,
Uh-huh.
I Feel the Earth Move would be, like, the most obvious one, or, like, Jazz Man or, like, Far Away. She's changing key
Yeah.
quite a lot. It's part of the Great American
Uh-huh.
Songbook tradition. It goes back to Cole Porter, right? So,
Sure.
we don't have it anymore because chords aren't seen as these engines that you use for that kind of stuff anymore. It's more
Uh-huh.
rhythmically and sonically based. But back then, pre postmodernism and pre modern recording technology, you know, that was part of
That's
the tool
another
belt.
thing.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Diane is was a big part of it. But then we get to Sweden, and I want to do something a bit more like Westlife. So we're actually, in some ways, we're kind of taking the songwriting
Westlife.
way down, and laying into
Okay.
because it's not
Yeah.
as sophisticated writing in some ways. A lot of the we're living in the world that Max Martin created,
We
but
sure
is it?
are.
Are we on the best possible timeline? I'm not sure. It's
What?
you know.
No.
Do you love it?
I
You love that stuff?
um, yes, yeah, in broader terms, we are absolutely not on the best possible timeline, but I we are living in Max Martin's world
Yeah.
still, and, the Celine Dion arc, I think that the Max Martin universe allows us to better appreciate the music that Celine Dion made in
Yeah.
the 90s, right? You can go back to, like, the Jim Steinman
Yeah.
bombast of it all and appreciate the craft, that goes into something that looks, like, very disposable and very corny and very broad, but, like, how hard it is to do that. It is harder to do that
Oh,
sometimes and
yeah.
to write like a very intimate like guy with a guitar song, right? Like just I think we have the tools, the vocabulary, and the mentality to at least grapple with the artistry of
Mhm.
Celine Dion's discography a little better, thanks to Max Martin. Thanks to like Max
Yeah.
Martin being one of these figures that like showed that like pop can be art, for anyone who still needed to hear that.
I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because like, actually, recording and mixing all this stuff as well,
Yeah.
I had to go back and listen to, very, very closely to a lot of these mixes, and you listen to, "Falling Into You," or I like "Because You Love Me," right?
Hmm.
And it's like this. It's as wide as this, and there's a million it's almost like Broadway musical standard of, like, instruments are fading in and they're fading
Hmm.
out, and there's this beautiful kind
Broadway,
of
Vegas.
orchestral quality that you really only see in high quality musicals, and there's like Dan Huff's on the guitar and he's got this perfectly
Uh-huh.
dialed in, rhythm
Yeah.
tone, and it's that sort of thing. And then you go to the Swedish stuff and it's like the stereo image is really narrow and you think, okay, this is really
Hmm.
interesting. They were mixing in a basement with a lot of weed smoke. John Simon talks about this a lot in The Song Machine. They were
Yeah.
working on relatively cheap equipment, and they're using
Hmm.
PCM synthesizers and lots of digital samples, and they weren't in the best,
Right.
they were not like in LA with the world's best session musicians. They were putting together
Right,
something
right.
really potent, but they were doing it was a lot more DIY. I was going to say punk, it's not.
Hmm.
Like, it was a lot more DIY, but the reason that it worked, right, is because that simplicity mixed with the melodicism that Max Martin kind of had in him, but also picked up from ABBA a lot, and
Sure.
it was very much the chord changes and the melodicism of ABBA married to a kind of really stripped back sonic sensibility of modern pop, right? And between that, they kind of captured lightning in a bottle, and then somehow kept it going for 30 years afterwards, right?
Yeah. The phrase just it's just something that Lord said in an interview that I think stuck in a
Yeah,
lot of people's heads, including mine, but the idea of melodic math,
yeah,
that what Max Martin sort of introduced is like you think of California Girls by Katy Perry and just the precision of the
mhm,
syllables. That like what the words mean is not important as the way that every individual syllable
yeah,
strikes, like California, just the precision of that. For
yeah,
some people, like the coldness of that, the math of that. When you were talking about like the studio difference. It made me think of Michael Jackson's Thriller,
yeah,
right? And then the Daft Punk record that explicitly like went for that feel, right? Like
yeah,
after, Daft Punk, of course, which did as much as anybody to bring like dance music, electronic music to like help people understand
mhm,
like that could be art and sort of change the definition of what pop can be. But like when Daft Punk wants to make like their Grammy winning record, what they do is they get like a bunch of people, like famous, super musicians of the
mhm,
Nile Rodgers quality, and they put them in a studio and they do it like Thriller, right? Like you
mhm,
want that feel of like really expensive people playing really expensive
yeah.
instruments in a really expensive studio, right? And that becomes retro, whatever year, 2011, 2012, 2013. I forget when that record came out, but like by then
Mhm,
it's like retro to think
yeah.
about pop music that way.
Yeah, it's really old school. I mean, they were kind of the last of their kind as well. They're kind
Yeah.
of they but I mean, the thing about, like, Daft Punk is they were just so good, right? I mean, they just everything they did was so
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was so good. Like,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah. Yeah.
everything. It was amazing tunes, amazing, like, there's so much
Mhm.
dynamism in their work. I mean, they're one of the great songwriting duos of all time. They're easily in there with, like, Carole King and Jerry Goffin and all of that. They should be part of that conversation. I don't know.
That's your next
Yeah,
game
yeah,
right
right,
there.
yeah, 2 anonymous songwriters. How compelling. Um,
The pyramid. Yeah, just the meet cute and the pyramid or whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, man. Do
I
it.
mean I
Do
mean,
it.
it's interesting, but we're talking about this kind of, so we're talking about this kind of passage of authenticity of, like, pop
Hmm.
being now considered pretty pretty well, right? It's written, Taylor Swift is, like, written about in the
Mhm.
same well, I suppose in some way I was gonna say compared to who, but I'm not sure who. Phoebe Bridgers maybe, or Maddie Cunningham or something like that. They all
Yeah.
feel like they're on the same sort of level, and she spends as much time in their world as they spend in her world and stuff like
Right, right.
that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, do you think I mean, I still thinking about, like, do you think that the Max Martin stuff was a way that eventually it sort of just overpowered the critical thing, because obviously at the time I've been rewatching that Woodstock documentary, and a lot of that
Oh
was
dear.
about rock versus pop in the late
Right,
90s,
right.
right? So, I mean, do you think that, how did that sort of come? I mean, did it just kind of happen
Okay.
through osmosis later? Or
What's he? Oh, that Woodstock. That's like the Offspring with like the cardboard cutouts of like In Sync or the Backstreet Boys.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
yeah,
feel
yeah.
like that Woodstock '99 moment is about boy bands,
Mhm.
right? And like TRL, right? Like the
Yeah.
contrast between the Backstreet Boys on TRL and like Corn on TRL, right? Like that's another really harsh divide that doesn't so much feel like a divide anymore. As you
Mhm.
say, like Max Martin's is one of the most dynamic and influential figures in pop in the last 20 years, right? And we are,
Yeah.
as you said, sort of living in the world he created. Like there have been backlashes to, that plasticity perceived as plasticity,
Mhm.
that math, right? And a figure like Lord is sort of sometimes doing like a straight pop diva thing and sometimes very
Mhm.
much explicitly not. And like, the melodic math is off on purpose. Like Max Martin at this point is as much somebody to be pushed against as to be leaned into, that entire idea.
Yeah.
You said something and it made me think of something else and now I forgot it. And that's too
I mean,
bad.
it's
This is
interesting.
why I
Yeah.
script my shit right here.
I mean,
It's just I can go ahead.
no, it's fine. I mean, in terms of, like, the modern pop star, like, do you I mean, I was sort of thinking about Adele, but do we have modern analogs for Elliott Smith and Celine Dion, or is everything too mixed up these days, genre-wise, and the demise of the monoculture and the counterculture? Do we still have any of that left, or did that kind of go with like Bright Eyes and people like that about 10 years ago? What do
Hmm.
you think?
Thank you for asking a question that reminded me of it was Phoebe Bridgers.
Yeah.
Phoebe Bridgers, like that record Punisher, like she's a huge Elliott Smith fan,
Hmm.
right? Like I think she would say that like Elliott Smith is perhaps her single biggest
Yeah.
inspiration. And on her earliest records, you can really hear that. And you can still hear that on Punisher, but Punisher is the record that also makes her in kind like a pop star.
Mhm.
She's smashing guitars on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
She's razzing David Crosby on Twitter, like she's headlining festivals. Like that's an example. There would be so much arduous conversation if she had started in the '90s as
Mhm.
like an Elliott Smith type figure and then progressed, like got that popular. Like that would be a selling out type like argument, like Liz Fair, right? Like Liz Fair, one of the most like just this critically adored figure, makes these records, Exile to start with, but I people love it and people hold her up as this sort of counterculture, pushing back against the pop
Mhm.
machine figure.
Mhm.
And then it's not Max Martin, but it's the Matrix, right? Like she makes like a pop record, like a super pop
Yeah.
record, and Pitchfork gives it a zero.
Like she becomes
It's
Jewel all
reviled.
of a sudden or something
Yeah,
like that.
exactly.
Yeah,
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 Jewel
yeah.
is a very good way of framing that. But like, we did not, whatever year that was, like 2001 to
Yeah.
2003, somewhere in there. Like, we did not. We were not yet living. We were, but we didn't really understand. We were living in Max Martin's universe. Like, we took that. Liz Fair superfans took that as a huge betrayal, and
Yeah.
like rock critics who'd convinced themselves that they had some personal stake in her career convinced themselves that it was a huge betrayal. Like that's whether or not that's a great record. I really love it. Is sort of irrelevant to the fact of like that record was ahead of its time and understanding that those walls didn't really exist anymore, right? And
Mhm.
so Phoebe Bridgers is an example for me of someone who can be very clearly artistically inspired by Elliott Smith, but can quickly, like within a few years, sort of rise to like not a Celine Dion level, right? Because no one that level kind of doesn't exist anymore, as you said. She's not like a Vegas showman. Like she's not like Celine Dion, but she can be a pop star the way people used to think of Celine Dion as a pop star, but with like the raw building blocks of Elliott Smith. Like that's the difference now.
I mean, I think that, like, also, like, Madison Cunningham, who is clearly,
Hmm.
has an enormous Beatles influence in her sound and is very close to
Yeah.
Smith, and she's a fabulous guitarist. She can play lots of
Hmm.
instruments. she's got this real, complicated style of writing, and she sounds a
Mm.
a lot more like a latter-day Smith than just about most people who try to sound like Elliott Smith, because 'cause she's got those chops, which he
Uh-huh.
could play Rachmaninoff, and she's got these amazing,
Yeah.
chops, and she's on, Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon, and I think she's gonna be a really big star in the next
Yeah.
year, and there's nothing in between her about having to negotiate that kind of cultural space,
Mhm.
which is also a kind of victory for gender, right? And do we think that, like, Taylor
Yeah.
Swift has actually paved this with her folk records? And I always
Mhm.
think the thing I kind of find quite interesting about, like, what Swift has done moving from, like, authentic country to not authentic country to authentic pop
Mhm.
to not very authentic indie,
Mm.
is like she's opened up these areas by kind of flattening them out. It's like she's bulldozed the gaps between all of them, by saying, well, if I can go
Right.
here, then there's this kind of, this open land. I've knocked all the fences down. And I think
Yeah.
for me, the only kind of problem is that she insists on taking Jack Antonoff with her wherever she goes, which and
Everyone does
and
these days,
and the
unfortunately.
problem
He's
is
he's the Max
I
Martin.
know, but he's
Yeah.
he's not good enough. Like, I just think he's just not as good. He's not as talented as some of the
Mm.
people who used to occupy that space. But he seems to be everywhere and now. But I suppose that's what happens, isn't it? But like, yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. So there was a thing which I wanted to ask you about, because you've actually talked about quite a few of these on your show. But what are your actual favorite kind of picks of power ballads from the '90s, and why?
Power ballads from the '90s. Ooh. I was just thinking about Queensryche, Silent Lucidity.
Uh huh.
Is that '90s? That's right in that late '80s. That might be '80s. No, it's 1990. Silent Lucidity is pretty dope, man. I was thinking about that
Yeah.
song the other, and like the scope of that, like where it starts and where it ends up, and like
Uh-huh.
it feels all of the piece.
Mhm.
Like that's I feel like however much revered that song is, we do not revere Silent Lucidity
I don't think
enough.
I've heard that.
It's funny, like I was like an
Yeah.
'80s hair metal guy, in a casual way, who became like a super grunge guy, right? And
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
totally bought into the idea that the latter obliterated the former. And so like power ballads aren't cool, if you follow that arc, but like something like November Rain, something like Don't Cry,
Mhm.
like the Guns N' Roses classics of that period, like Poison, those aren't, Every Rose Has Its Thorn is probably not '90s,
Yeah.
but like I don't think so much about '90s power ballads, just because like the '90s, as I experienced it as a
Mhm.
teenager, was at least hypothetically like opposed to the idea of power
Yeah.
ballads, whereas something like Black Hole Sun, is closer to a power ballad than not. You know what I mean? Like it was like a category. I convinced myself that the category no longer existed, but it absolutely did. And there are all these power ballads I love
Mm.
that I don't necessarily think of
I mean, would
as
you
like
call,
REO
like, is
Speedwagon.
"Unbreak My Heart" a power ballad?
Oh wow, yes, absolutely it is. Yes,
"Don't
yes.
Wanna Miss a
There's
Thing" by
another great.
Aerosmith?
I did a whole don't Diane
Yeah.
Warren. That's Aerosmith is Don't Want to Miss a Thing is the ultimate Billy. Aerosmith, like What It Takes by Aerosmith. Like I
Yeah.
love that song off Pump. Like that's either 89 or 90, but no. Don't Want to Miss a Thing is a fantastic example, right? Because it's a Diane Warren song.
Mhm.
Like it should have won the Oscar. It's a rock band, like a '70s rock band that became like an '80s MTV rock band that became like a '90s, like look at our cool videos, like alternative by default band.
Yeah.
Like, but Don't Want to Miss a Big Thing is just the power ballad
'Cause they
from a movie, and yeah,
and The
absolutely.
Bodyguard, obviously, I mean, that was, we have this whole thing about Strong, and it's from this movie which Jamie Lee
Mhm.
Curtis is being taught kickboxing by Steven Seagal to defend herself against, abusive ex-husband Bruce Willis, and I think I actually took this from one of your other pods, is that Steven Seagal is constantly drinking orange juice, and that is a thing from one of your pods, right? You talk about how much Kevin Costner drinks orange juice in The
Oh,
Body.
that's right. No,
Yeah,
I was thinking Steven Seagal, but no, he loves orange juice, right? Like that's his
yeah.
quirk. He
He has
has a
2 glasses in one
sword
scene.
and he drinks orange. That's yes. what a strange characterization of a person. But no, I had forgotten the orange. But you're absolutely right. It's like, do you want some orange juice? I'm gonna have some. You're like, yeah, it's bizarre.
We
What a
borrowed, like,
weird
whole
movie.
chunks of Bodyguard review for, writing about Strong
Yeah,
in Morelli
yeah.
and Rochelle, and, yeah, the orange juice is in this, picture of Jamie Lee Curtis being trained by, Steven Seagal in a dojo, and just this picture of orange juice right at the front.
Oh
Um
my god, that's fantastic.
But, like, yeah, I mean, I think I was just something you reminded me of is that a hilarious bit in, like, The Decline and Fall of Western Civilization where Aerosmith, who've just come out of rehab, are being interviewed, and she's like, "So you good?" They're like, we're better," and just like, they're, like, putting on the show because they must have just released Pump
Right.
or something, right? And that was such an important movie for me. I did try to get Penelope on the game. And in fact, there
Really?
is a character called Spheris later, who's a documentarian later in the
Is she
game.
reachable? Is she accessible
She wrote
hypothetically,
she wrote
Penelope?
straight back.
Wow, that's awesome. That's fantastic.
She
She did
was
Wayne's World, man.
yeah.
That's just
Well, I like that she got it from doing The Decline and Fall of Western Civilization.
right. Yeah,
I'm trying to
that's
push
a
that.
rad arc.
Yeah, I'm trying to
Yeah.
push that on her as much, on other people as much as possible. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I hear that I haven't seen the Alanis documentary, but I hear there's a whole lot of stuff that I could have taken inspiration from in that, but
Hmm.
didn't. Did you watch the Kenny G documentary? That's another
I
90s thing,
have
right?
not. Yeah, I have to say I have not. The Alanis one I did watch, and
Yeah.
Alanis is an interesting figure as well.
Mhm.
A Canadian pop star, that becomes, like sort of an aspiring, I guess, Canadian pop star who becomes like an American codified like alternative rock star,
As all
right?
good
And
Canadians do from the band onwards, yeah.
right.
America's greatest
Shania,
rock
yeah.
band for Canadians.
4 out of 5. We got one we snuck one in there. Yes, but I have not seen the Kenny G one, no. I've always meant to, but I'm gonna blame my 3 children
That's
for
fine.
any and all movies that I have not seen. But
Oh,
yes, was there something in there that struck you as
I think it's really interesting. I mean, there was this great did you read that, anthology about 15 years ago called Bad Music? Do you remember that?
no.
Oh, it was
Hmm.
great. I mean, I was like my early 20s and I was sort of roving around New York and buying books back when you did those sorts of things
That's a very
and
cool thing to do,
reading them. Yeah.
yeah.
And there was this whole thing about like, can Kenny G be considered part of the jazz pantheon and the whole kind of Pat Metheny, but it was really about
I was
it was
just trying to think of his name, Pat
yeah,
Metheny,
it was like a meditation on, music that's typically considered bad, and can
yeah.
we, as academics, put words together in a certain order which makes it appear good, which is a very academic thing to do, right? And it's
That's kind of my job, yeah.
easier to do on the page than it is in real life. No, I think what's interesting about Kenny G, and I think this was spoken about in the New York Times when I was a New Yorker when they wrote about it, is that he seems to me like a thoroughly decent person and a
He
very,
does.
very bright, very able, guy. Like me, he's from Jewish family. He comes from a kind of a Catskills entertainment background. He knows who his crowd
Uh-huh.
is, and but maybe at the center of it, there's also a little bit of a fundamental lack of curiosity about expanding his horizons. And I think that
Hmm.
probably comes from the fact that he's one of the very few pure technicians to have become a real star, and that he still has
Hmm.
one foot in either camp. He's an entertainer, but there's a little bit of him which says, at least that's enough. So there's this kind of bit where he's talking about, I didn't want to, I wanted to play jazz, but I didn't want to play standards, so I'm running these new standards, and there's this kind of,
Mm.
there's just this little lack of contextual imagination, but it might also be that he's just been a star for so long, for to be honest, like he kind of keeps it together relatively well. I mean, I've been following this Diane Warren thing, with great interest, where she collided with the modern world. For those who don't know, she basically said something a little salty about a Beyonce thing, which follows in this long history she has of basically decrying multiple writers. Right,
Right.
very very long history of that.
Yep.
And she kind of ended up on the wrong end of the Bayhive, and she was pretty upset about it. I think because it made all the
I'm
press.
sure she
But I
was.
mean, I think that's fairly typical of like if someone's had the world coming to them for 30 years and basically saying,
Hmm.
"You're so wonderful, you're so wonderful, you're so wonderful." Those things are going to happen occasionally, and Kenny G appears to have. He has a very good Twitter account. He's completely ducked all of that. So I don't know. I mean, like,
Yeah.
he's an interesting character. He's had this kind of weird alien cultural renaissance where he's in Katy Perry videos and stuff like that. But like as an
Kim and
artist,
Kanye.
oh
Kanye
yeah,
hired him
yeah.
to
I mean,
play
that's
for Kim.
what's it called? This gospel or something? Oh yeah, and also he's on a Kanye record. I don't know. I'm not sure I have
Yep.
like a hard and fast thesis about him. I just think maybe he's like, yeah, he's similar to Celine and Elliot. He's a tool of the people who'd make a conversation about authenticity within a
Hmm.
cultural lineage. And his happened to be jazz, and theirs happened to be pop and
Right.
rock. So he's not so different to them in some respects.
I
I
think
mean,
of him
what do you think?
as well. I think of him in terms of Celine, like part of his decency is that he seemed to understand that he was uncool, like
Hmm.
deeply uncool.
Yeah.
And Pat Metheny, trashing him, that even the jazz authenticity conversation
Hmm.
feels different to me than just the fundamental idea of like, oh, Kenny G, right? Like it's like a joke in Office
Yeah.
Space, like he's just a punchline in one sense, and you can either lean into that or you can get really offended about that. And if you're willing to play with your image, then you can be like Michael Bolton, in a
Hmm.
Lonely Island video, however many years later. Like you can sort of you can be comfortable with who you are and the audience that you have and the millions upon millions of dollars that you have, right? But like
Hmm.
Kenny G just sort of understood, is like, I'm never going to be cool,
Yeah.
the way Elliott Smith is certainly, or the way like anybody you'd ever think of as cool is cool. He understands that that's
Yeah.
not for him. And I think Celine Dion is a little different. Like it's very troubling to read about her early history and how mean people were about her looks,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
like especially when she is like a child, like
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
teenager. Like there's an unavoidable sort of sexist aspect to that. And so it's not enough to say that people thought Celine Dion was uncool, right, in 1998 or whatever. Like there was a real sort of foundation of cruelty to a lot of how we talked about her. But Kenny G is just a figure who like played to the moms, as you said,
Hmm.
and sort of understood who his audience was and who his audience wasn't. And I think that if you hang on to that for long enough, in addition to the lucrative success of like appealing to the moms for 20 years, like
Hmm.
people will look back on you now with some degree of generosity and love. And it's like, oh, it's
Yeah.
Kenny G from the '90s. Like I thought it was crap at the time, but he's pretty cool. He seems like an all right guy. He's on a Kanye record, whatever. Like it's you. If you hang on long enough, then that arc will swing back around, and you can be
Hmm.
cool in retrospect.
You've got to stay on the bus, I think, but there is a certain savviness as well there. I mean, I think Celine is slightly different because she's kind of, I suppose she's so undeniable, and also she's worth like $2 billion as well.
Yeah,
And
I
I
mean
think,
that's the other thing.
yeah, I think the
Yeah,
Vegas residency kind of changed everything for Celine, even though it was kind of late in her career, because it kind of presented this way of living in which she doesn't need to go out on tour anymore and she doesn't need to release big singles. But I think
yeah.
like, I mean, we're thinking about like Nickelback also. It used to be said that
Mm,
they played three versions of How You Remind Me in every single show. There used to be an acoustic
right.
version and then it would start with it and then do it in the encore. So they kind of knew who
Sure.
they
It's a
were.
good
But I
point.
mean, the character I find quite interesting right now is John Mayer, who appears to have completely like sailed over all the choppy seas. I mean, 12, 15 years ago, was it? He compared his penis to a Nazi. And,
Oh my God. Yeah,
you
white
know,
supremacist. My my
yeah.
my dick is a white
I mean,
supremacist. Oh
Stephen
my.
Hyden
Yeah.
writing about, I mean, he was sort of writing about it at the time that like John Mayer joined Dead and Company, which was a really savvy move. But,
Right.
Mayer has somehow been able to commute the fact that he's a really good guitarist. He's always been able to use that as some sort of
Of
currency,
course.
even when he was a teen
Yeah.
heartthrob. He's kind of
Mhm.
transcended all that, and now he's become a sort of, I don't know, guitar playing sort of Michael Bublé who's good on Instagram and stuff like that. He seems comfortable in this world, like he has a good kind of
Huh.
digital presence. I mean, to my
Well,
mind.
he's I remember the Chappelle show being a big deal at the time. Like
Hmm.
that was the coolest thing you could possibly have been on in that moment, 2003, 2003 or whatever. And it's yeah, that John Mayer is a very complex combination of like disposable teen heartthrob, but
Mhm.
also like shit hot guitarist who can, you know, jam with the Dead for 6 hours, versus like somebody who should never give an interview again.
Yeah.
You know, just there's this, there was always this divide between the stateliness of his music and like the absolute chaos of like his personal life and every word that came out of his mouth. You know, and his last
Yeah.
record as of now, I can't think of the title, but like he made like an 80s,
It was
now he's
called,
doing Long
Sad Rock.
Train or
Was it
something.
Sad Rock? Was it called? Yeah.
Sad.
Sa
Oh man, how do I not know the title of that
sa
record? I'm
um,
sorry, I gotta look it up now.
it wasn't it called Sad Rock, like Dad Rock, wasn't it?
It's a clever version
Sob Rock.
of
It's
that.
Sob Rock, yeah.
Sob,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, and he made, like
Jeez, I'm so bad.
he's making Clapton in the '80s music.
Exactly. That's exactly what he's doing. And he's another person
Yeah.
who has always sort of understood that he was uncool, you know, and is pretty okay with it, you know, and is just willing to memify himself. Like
Mhm.
once that became the currency, right? Like he sort of, most of the time he is in on the joke about himself, you know, but he has this foundation, as you say, of being like an incredible guitarist, like an incredible songwriter. You know, it's like
Yeah.
there's a James Taylor element to him, and there's a chaotic like Kanye West, you
Or a
know, please
chaotic
stop
James
talking.
Taylor element to it
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Like,
giving James Taylor way too
I
much
would say it
credit.
was
Thank
marginally
you.
less chaotic than
Yeah.
James Taylor, actually.
That is absolutely fair to
A
say.
low key James Taylor,
Yeah.
but like James Taylor, what was he? He was on heroin, shagging his way around
Right.
Coral
Yeah.
Canyon with
Yeah.
JD
That's,
Souther and stuff like that, and yeah.
I blew past a lot of James Taylor's extracurriculars there. I really did, and
But
I
like, I
regret
mean, I guess the thing with those stars, right, is they have something to fall back on, right? And like Celine's
it.
always had her voice to fall back on, and she's been able to
Right.
preserve her voice pretty well, actually. And I think she had to learn to re-sing at some point. And
Mhm.
so I mean, like that's kind of the thing which these kind of true blue American stars, and you think about people like George Benson and stuff as well, like that. These true kind of entertainers, they've always had this like high grade traditional American elite quality, right? They're
Mm.
either super beautiful or super charismatic or often just a great musician. And Americans love great musicians, right? They'll put a lot aside to see someone play or sing or dance really, really well. And
Right.
that kind
Lady
of
Gaga
yeah.
just popped into my head as an example of somebody who like started out as like a massive pop star,
Mhm.
you know, just a creature of the Max Martin universe, right? And like a totally
Yeah.
electronic, you know, digital diva, you know, but she can also like put on a ball gown, you know, and sing in front of a grand piano at the
Yeah.
Grammys, right? Like in A Star Is Born, she can like literalize, you know, the divide between like authentic rock musician and inauthentic pop musician, right? Like
Yeah.
she's sort of walking around with the Riley and Rochelle divide, like in her person, in her whole persona.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you feel like she took it, that much further. I mean, for us in Britain, Amy Winehouse straddled that
Of
divide in a
course.
much more low key way, but she was in some ways
Yeah.
she was probably the best singer in pop music of maybe the last 30 years, maybe post Whitney Houston, I would say. Don't you
I don't know
think?
if I can argue with that.
Oh,
No,
right, yeah.
there's a very, I mean, there's sort of a,
I mean,
unfortunately, the scarcity of her music, you
yeah.
know, like this is one of these cases. It's like Jeff Buckley in that sense, right?
Mhm.
Like when you're locked into that one, you know, it's not her only record, but that one fantastic record, and that's all you leave. You know, the potential that she had is so much of, I think, the way that we think about Amy Winehouse now. But
Yeah.
I can't disagree with you that
I
like
mean,
as just a pure
I just think about
voice,
those
like
live
yeah.
things where she would do a live thing on Jules Holland, and she'd just do the same song, but she'd
Mm.
do it so differently, because she was
Right,
a
right.
jazz singer. She had that music, she had that
Hmm.
timing, which like that
Right.
kind of Lou Reed God-given timing. Didn't sing like Lou
Yeah.
Reed, but it's like
No, but I know what you mean. You can't teach like the sort of swagger
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that she had. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that seems like a cool place to leave it. I've taken up your time for an
Yeah,
hour and a
this has
bit,
been
but I
fantastic.
mean, I'm
I've
cool.
never, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, no,
Go
please
ahead.
carry on.
Well, no, I was just gonna say I've never been in this situation before. where to talk with somebody about a video game that they've made in part because of, you know, a show that I made, like, this whole thing is just awesome, and just a very new experience to me, and I
Cool.
really appreciated that.
Well, stick
It was
about
an
for a
honor.
sec. I'm gonna stop the recording,
Yeah.
but we can
Yeah,
definitely,
yeah,
like, hang
sure.
for a minute more as well. Okay,
Sure.
cool. Well, Rob, thanks